Well, greetings to our audience. We're glad that you've taken time on a very busy day to join us for an important discussion about energy security in light of the conflagration in the Middle East. My name is Clay Seigle. I'm a senior fellow and James Schlesinger Chair in Energy and Geopolitics here at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Our energy security and climate change team, as well as our larger economic security and technology department, have been fully engaged in assessing the risks to energy security. Many of you have seen our published reports and our media engagements on the issue in the past couple of weeks. I would encourage you to check back frequently to our website at csis.org for our latest. It's also possible from there to subscribe to our newsletter to have a push of new content sent to you. Now, our agenda for this concise briefing is to introduce our expert guests and elicit their insights on the rapidly evolving energy security situation in the Middle East. They are well positioned to help us understand how commodity and financial markets are reacting to the rapidly evolving situation, and also to let us know maybe what the conventional wisdom, the market consensus may be missing at a very important hour. So let me briefly introduce them and we will get on with it. First, let me introduce Raad Alkadiri. He is a non-resident senior associate at CSIS. He is an international country risk specialist with more than 20 years experience advising senior oil and gas management on long-term investment strategies, risk mitigation, and stakeholder engagement in the energy sector. Raad has held senior positions at Eurasia Group, Boston Consulting Group, IHS Energy, PFC Energy, and he served as senior policy advisor at the UK Embassy in Baghdad. So welcome, Raad. Glad you're here.
Great pleasure to be here. Thank you.
And let me also introduce Adi Imsirovic, who is also a non-resident senior associate here at CSIS. He is a lecturer at the University of Oxford and brings 35 years of experience in oil trading, including head of oil trading at Gazprom Marketing and Trading, also as regional manager of Texaco Oil Trading. He was a Fulbright Scholar at Harvard University and an adjunct fellow at the Kennedy School of Government. And he is an accomplished author of 2 books on oil trading, as well as numerous scholarly monographs on oil and gas prices, the benchmarks, and energy security. So good afternoon to you, Adi, joining us from Europe.
Good afternoon, Clay. Thank you.
And maybe, Adi, let me kick it off and start with you, because all eyes are on prices this morning for sure. Of course, it's been a relatively modest price hike during the past 11 or so days of this military campaign. It seems to signal a relatively sanguine market when we think about the importance of supply from the region. One would have thought that the acute risk of a disruption from the Strait of Hormuz might carry a higher price than $75 per barrel. So how would you describe oil market psychology at this stage?
Thank you, Clay, very much so, and a great introduction. In fact, the only correction I would like to make is that all eyes were on the market from last night here in the UK, because the markets opened just after 10 o'clock last night here. And I spoke to a couple of traders during the day as well. One thing I can tell you, let's get that out of the way, okay? The smart money is not short in this market for sure. But there are a number of reasons why the market is not going much higher, and I'll come back to that in a brief second. Basically, what we've seen is roughly a $10 price increase since the beginning of the hostilities, which is not much for the old days. As we remember before, people were expecting, even Goldman Sachs still expect the market to go over $110 a barrel if we lose half of the oil coming out of the Strait of Hormuz. I think the biggest problem is, first of all, expectation of the market. And we can talk about it. Raad will step in, I'm sure, about possibility or feasibility of blocking the Strait of Hormuz. On its own, Iran exports up to 2 million barrels of crude and petroleum products, which is not a huge amount given that at the moment supply and demand situation is rather precarious for the producers. For example, OPEC Plus have at least 6.5 million barrels of spare capacity. China is not firing on all cylinders, and demand, if anything, seems to be peaking, at least for gasoline. We have a situation where, if I could draw a demand and supply curve, we are very much on the sort of elastic part of the supply curve. So any shift in demand really doesn't do much. Equally, any shift in supply doesn't have big impact on oil prices. So as things stand right now, it seems to me that the market is pricing in the fact that Iran is very unlikely to do anything about the Strait of Hormuz, which I think is the key in this whole story. And the reason is, number one, that Iran has never done that in the past. They might have tried in the 80s in the war with Iraq. And the second reason is that it would really, really hurt Iranian interests as well. Iran is desperate for that oil to be exported because they need hard currency. At the same time, all of their potential allies would be hurt. The biggest buyer of Iranian barrels by far is China. Okay, so and China very much has a lot of exposure to the shipping from the Strait of Hormuz. In terms of crude and products, some 5 million barrels a day. So the whole of Asia, India would be hurt a lot. So really, this whole crude oil story is very much biased. We are looking at it very much from the Western perspective, but it's really Asia that worries a lot about what's going on in the area. So I guess that will be the focus, Strait of Hormuz and possibility of potentially blocking it. And sort of geopolitical situation, which I think is very, very important because we haven't heard very much from China at this stage.
That's quite right. And in a way, the silence has been deafening for such an important inflection point for global geopolitics. Well said, Adi, and thanks for the opening perspective. I wonder, Raad, when we think about maybe kind of where this is going and in terms of the scope, Israel's stated war aims from the beginning were the nuclear threat, the missile threats, but may have also expanded. It's pretty thinly veiled at this point to include change to the regime in Tehran and maybe even toppling the government. I believe, if I'm not mistaken, that one of President Trump's posts yesterday even flirted with or insinuated something about regime change. So, question for you is, would an expansion of the military campaign to include changes to the Iranian government translate to greater risk for Gulf energy exports?
Yeah, I think it would. I mean, the market seemed to be in a position to sort of paraphrase the great movie Jerry Maguire, show me the interruption. And so it wants to see, I think, very clear evidence of Iran taking steps. So yesterday's statement by the Iranian parliament, advocating for the closure of the Straits of Hormuz, worried the market, but still leaves wiggle room. It does go back to that political question. What is the end game? What is the end game for Israel? What is the end game for the United States? And critically, what does Iran perceive the end game of those two to be? I mean, we talk about Iran in terms of not wanting to take steps to hurt buyers in Asia. We talk about Iran not wanting to damage its relations with the Gulf states, the Arab Gulf states, that have, been largely, if rhetorically, but largely supportive of Iran in terms of this. Certainly have condemned the Israeli operation, and expressed a certain amount of concern about the US operation over the weekend. But all of that presumes that Iran isn't fighting an existential battle or doesn't see itself as fighting an existential battle. If it does, then all bets will be off. The biggest priority will be protecting the regime and creating some form of deterrence. And a sense of deterrence. And, oil is clearly something that the Iranian regime has been reluctant to interfere with thus far. The Straits of Hormuz hasn't really been interfered with to a great extent thus far. But if the Iranians perceive themselves to be in an existential battle, then we are back to something like the 1980s, where you had both Iraq and Iran targeting vessels, the missile wars, and a risk that you could see the Iranians certainly sort of mining parts of the Straits of Hormuz. But that is something for the future. It takes us back to what is the political endgame here? And it's not clear. I mean, for the Trump administration thus far, the stated goal seems to be, the weekend was a one and done. And it was designed to send a message, and as long as Iran's response is contained, as long as Iran doesn't go after US targets or something, it is something symbolic, then the Trump administration seemingly can live with it. You do have the wild card of the president himself, who on one day is tweeting about killing, the supreme leader of Iran, and on another day is talking about negotiations. If I was an Iranian leader right now, I'm not sure how much I would trust a word that comes out of President Trump's mouth. Certainly, it's a confusing set of signals. But I think the other issue is, what do the Israelis do next? The targeting of Raad potentially opened up an avenue to de-escalation. The big nuclear target was hit. If we are to believe the president, it was obliterated, although his military commanders are being somewhat more cautious. But what we've seen also overnight is an escalation of Israeli targeting of regime targets and Israeli strikes on regime targets in Tehran. That might be the last throws. We've also seen Netanyahu say something about, Israel's military objective is almost achieved. So it really does depend on that sort of aspect of things and how the Iranians respond. How are they interpreting the signals here? Clearly, they're going to continue responding to any Israeli strikes. But what do they see and what do they understand from the messages that are being sent privately by back channels from the administration and very publicly in the media, that the administration intended a one-off strike and really wants to sit on the sidelines right now?
Right. Yep. Helpful perspective to think about the signals that are being received in Tehran and how they'll interpret. Good point. Well, let's talk a little bit more about the market reaction. And Adi, of course, this is your area of expertise. Many of our audience will know that, in a way, there's actually two oil markets. There's a physical oil market where the wet stuff is traded, and then there's also the financial market with futures, options, other derivatives. So I'd like to hear your assessment of how both physical and financial traders are positioning for the possibility of escalation and maybe supply disruption. What are you seeing in some of the main metrics, market structure, maybe product differentials, arbitrage between geographical regions that give some sense of how the market is positioning for this?
Correct, Clay. Thank you very much. You absolutely are right. We've got this dichotomy in the oil market, and the way I like to present it, at least the simplest model, is that the usual refiners and traders of the physical oil tend to influence the market structure, which is backwardation and contango. And it's the financial markets that actually drive the flat price, the absolute price level. So let's start first with the physical players. prior to Israeli attack, we had a very strange structure where we had kind of a little bit of backwardation at the front end, and then later on next year, for example, all the spreads were kind of in contango, which is very odd situation. Now, if you actually go back to what I said earlier on, given this potential large surplus of oil that was expected this year, namely International Energy Agency expected supply to be at least 1.8 million barrels, whereas demand, they actually reduced down to about 720,000 barrels. So there was about 1 million barrels of excess supply prior to this whole situation. So everyone was really relaxed with the current stock situation. There was no problems. Of course, as soon as the attack happened, traders are very quick to think, okay, what are we going to do? Which oil is the safest? Which oil is the best to buy to cover our potential shorts? Which kind of oil is the best to avoid any disruptions and delays in the strait, potentially if the Strait of Hormuz is affected? So the first thing that happened was that, first of all, Brent differentials for physical Brent. When I say physical Brent, that's a whole bunch of North Sea crudes, including WTI as well, went into steep
West Texas
backwardation.
Intermediate, the U.S. benchmark crude.
Correct. West Texas Intermediate Midland is part of the Brent benchmark and is physically deliverable into the benchmark. And dated Brent is essentially a physical crude that's deliverable into the benchmark. So that went into steep premium, well over $2 a barrel over the futures market. So that clearly told them, said what market thought about it, was very concerned. Of course, Brent and WTI grades are fairly safe outside the zone. So that would make a lot of sense. Then the next one, I call them canary in the coal mine, are the West African barrels. They were actually struggling to move prior to this, and they very, very, very quickly went at very quite healthy differentials. Now, with flat price level blowing out, obviously about $10 a barrel, as you would expect, most of the refinery margins just got killed because the products have not followed. The reason they haven't followed is that's not a result of actual demand increase rather than supply shortage. So the refineries got hurting. The only one odd one out is diesel, together with other middle distillates like diesel and jet. For obvious reasons, about 2 million barrels is coming out of the Middle East because Middle East is a big exporter of these middle distillates. Okay, plus, let's face it, there's a lot of aircraft flying around in the area, military aircraft, they're probably using a lot of jet. Having said that, today I learned that not a lot of civilian flights have been stopped because that part of the world is right on the crossroads between sort of, Europe and Asia. So my son, who is currently in Thailand, is stuck there because he can't get back to Dubai. But that's the kind of situation we're talking about. Also, you have interesting situation with Middle Eastern barrels such as Murban that comes from UAE. It's loaded from Fujairah, which is just outside the Strait of Hormuz, has been bid up in a very large premium over the rest of the grades. So Oman is the same. So we have this interesting situation where sort of these grades have been quite beat up. Now, moving on to the financial markets. Well, hedge funds and smart money managers basically boosted their position in Brent futures quite a bit. And I think the last number I saw, which is actually quite stale, it's probably Thursday night, Friday, was their Brent positions almost tripled from on the speculative positions. Okay, so interesting one. I spoke to a very senior figure in CME this morning, and he said that one product that's been booming on their exchange have been weekly options. Weekly options, not more options are normally traded on monthly or quarterly basis. It's a weekly option, very, very short term. Which is quite interesting. It's interesting that it tells me that market is anticipating this to be as a short-term disruption rather than a long-term one. And that would also is reflected in the market structure where all the, for example, Brent spreads and Dubai spreads at the front end, they're steeply backwardated, but they do gradually and then quite fast going into the end of this year, early next year, they actually come off and they're a lot lower. So this whole situation is assuming, in my mind, that the market is assuming that the situation is not going to deteriorate much from here. But there's a huge but, 100% in agreement with Raad. I think we just don't know what's going on. I'm scratching my head and thinking, what's the end game? And I love that expression. I think the end game is the key here. And the other key is Iranian response. It's been wounded quite badly. I think if Iran does not respond much, and if Israel and the United States say, okay, we've had a great weekend, we've done the job, I think we'll see the market come off by $10 relatively quickly. But if there is some Iranian response in terms of US or particularly US assets in the area, I think we could see a very messy situation. And I think that's one of the reasons that China is waiting to see, because I'm really worried about this thing about China because they have a big stake here. Their security of supply, not American, not Israeli, is the Chinese security of supply is directly impacted here. And that needs to be taken into account.
Certainly. Certainly. Thanks, Adi. Those are fascinating anecdotes and perspectives, particularly about the physical market and some of those differentials that have opened up geographically based on relative, I guess, perception of risk. And so when we think about how this can unfold, and Adi, you mentioned that the short-term price direction will greatly depend on how it unfolds. I mean, Raad, post this US intervention and the bombing of the nuclear facilities, could you share a couple or a few political security scenarios and what you think their relative effects for energy export flows might be?
Yeah, I mean, look, I think in terms of what you're seeing right now, differentiate the energy response, I think, from some of the security and political outcomes that can come here. This is quite clearly a conflict that could go on for some time. And it really is sort of up to the Israelis at this moment in time, whether they have an end game for this operation, whether it is purely about the nuclear with Iran's nuclear capability, and how that is defined in the future, or whether it is about something deeper, and whether the Israelis are intending to follow a strategy that is, we've made our point, we've done our business, and we are going home, or whether they see this as now open-ended. And I think that starts to lead you down some sort of worrying escalatory scenarios. Do the Israelis adopt the same kind of strategy they've adopted with Lebanon and Hezbollah, where you have periodic strikes at what Israel claims are sort of imminent threats or threats? And how do you define those threats? Is Iran rebuilding its air defenses perceived as a threat and as an attempt to revive the nuclear program? I mean, you have some really big unanswered questions here that could get very messy. I think if if the Israelis declare mission accomplished, and go back home, that's a different matter altogether. I think you could see this conflict sort of diminish. Why I said that, look at energy supplies differently. Energy supplies are about the interruption of supply. So what outcomes are we looking at that really significantly disrupt supplies for an extended period of time? And as I say, that starts to be the scenarios where Iran perceives or actually faces clear existential threats, clear efforts that are unambiguously defined or unambiguously perceived as trying to remove the regime or weaken the regime. Statements by the president don't help in terms of that. I mean, it clouds the negotiating picture, it clouds the perception picture. Similarly, statements by Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, hinting that regime change might be a favorable outcome. That, I think, is the scenario and the drift and the escalation that poses the most extreme threat for oil supplies and for energy supplies, because it goes to the point of when Iran has nothing to lose, all bets are off. And right now, Iran clearly does have something to lose. And there has been there have been threats, that may be as much deterrent and anger as anything else. But when we get to the point where Iran feels it has nothing to lose, whether that's real or imagined, then I think you start to get into some of those scenarios where energy becomes a very materially at risk.
Good. And Raad, just a quick follow-up question for you with a quick answer. Why do you suppose Iran's refineries have stayed out of the Israeli crosshairs until now? If the mission creep is taking place and we're talking about rattling the regime, I mean, the only refinery that's been reportedly materially damaged in this war so far is the Israeli refinery in Haifa, which has been taken completely offline. The Israelis haven't gone after the Iranian refineries yet.
No, and I think that shows a certain amount of contained sort of mission goal. But that's something that can come later. Again, that's something that, I mean, it would have been seen as being escalatory by the Iranians. It would have brought energy directly into the ball game for the Iranians, and at that point, again, you risk unintended escalation. But I think, also the Israelis have adopted, again, something more akin to their Hezbollah strategy. Their efforts so far at sort of shaking the regime have been about taking out leaderships and creating that sense of fear and vulnerability amongst the leadership that anyone can be targeted and we know where you are. I think economic targets sort of have been secondary to that, and the leadership that has been targeted has, had some, or at least certainly until overnight, has had sort of some connection, sometimes loosely, but some connection to the nuclear and the ballistic missile capacity that Iran has. So, but moving towards the refineries, again, is one of those escalation steps one of those signposts that you would look out for. And, something, again, that therefore, something that the Iranian regime is like to see as being far more threatening to their long-term survival, and raises the risk, therefore, that energy becomes part of the game.
Makes sense. Thank you. Adi, the question from our audience, I think you're well positioned to field. How do you assess the real-time responsiveness of oil markets to geopolitical conflict signals like this Israel-Iran war? And are we witnessing a structural overreaction or an underpricing of long-term supply chain risks when we look at current oil futures?
Right. It's a great question, but having traded oil for 35 years, I can tell you that oil markets are very, very perfect. They take into account all the information and move very, very quickly, either in the absence or in addition of some new information that comes out. And markets are extremely reactive. I think right now, what markets are seeing is basically almost a game over situation. As soon as some other information comes out, the market will react to that very, very quickly. So I would not second guess markets. It's collective of some very, very smart people who are doing their job very seriously, doing some in-depth analysis before they take their positions. As I said, smart money is pretty much definitely not short. They are probably a little bit long and waiting to see the outcome. Again, I think it's a very fortunate situation, I think, generally for the global economy, that this is all happening just when, for example, and that's let me link it to China as well, which is a political issue. China probably hasn't come back that quickly and that aggressively about this issue because there are about 40 million barrels, according to Kepler, of Iranian oil pretty much anchored off the coast of China, unsold. At the same time, there are probably 70 million barrels of Iranian oil if you include Singapore, Malaysia, various onshore and offshore storage facilities. So I think there's that oil can very, very slowly go through the system before it becomes existential for China. But once China start getting worried about what's going on, I think, and if the situation continues to deteriorate, which I hope won't happen, then we would see a lot bigger reaction from the market. And yes, the oil could easily go over $100 a barrel.
Wow. Okay. We have some formidable challenges in the oil market and the geopolitical horizon as well. No two guys I can think of better equipped to help us understand what's at stake and how to think about the scenarios that could be unfolding here on both counts. Thank you both, Raad and Adi, for joining us. I hope that you'll come back soon. To our audience, thank you for joining as well. And again, an invitation to follow our latest at csis.org. For CSIS, I'm Clay Seigle. See you next time.